lose them?
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Sorry. We are recording now.
Yes.
Dawn, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you with that.
No. That's fine. I ended with my goal with the book was to understand our divergent paths. Not so much what happened, but when did we lose them? That was the animating force behind the book.
Yeah. So your book is not only about it's not only a memoir, it's not only about you, it's about two other women. How difficult was it for you to write a memoir about not just your life, but about these other two women?
Well, I saw our lives as it's being interwoven. And so our fates were also interwoven. And so my story is their story and their story is my story. So it almost felt like that I would not have had a memoir without talking about my sister, who shared the same bedroom with me, or my best friend who happened to have, her bedroom was directly above mine. I like to say that I met my sister in 1968 when I was 3 years old, and our parents brought her home. And from the very beginning, she was a mystery to me. I met Deborah in the 2nd grade. She was the prettiest girl in the school, already prom queen pretty, but she was also the one who stayed in the principal's office. And in the 2nd grade, we were 7 years old, and I would just stare at her, and because we were very different. For me, rules were scaffolding, but for her and my sister, they were these things that they pushed against. And so, but it wasn't until the 3rd grade. So in the 2nd grade, our teacher lined us up according to height. And I was always the tallest kid in the class and she was the shortest. And our worlds barely touched. But in the 3rd grade, our teacher, who was kind of this hippie type, who taught us yoga in class and allowed us to eat fresh vegetables and fruits and nuts. She organized us alphabetically. And that one logistical shift changed everything, because all of a sudden I was seated across the desk from Deborah Trice across from Dawn Turner. And we became best friends. And we learned that we had so much in common. We lived in the same 24-story tower. And out of all of those apartments, her bedroom, as I just said, was right above mine. And she would knock on her floor in her bedroom, and I would knock on the ceiling, get up on the windowsill and then knock on the ceiling. And we would talk across the divide that way. And we would spend our afternoons after homework, doing homework after school in the stairwell. It was like our tree house. And so we were these 3 girls. My sister, my mother made me bring my younger sister along all the time. But the 3 of us traversed our community in the spirit of, we were big readers as well. And we read the Pippi Longstocking series. And Pippi Longstocking was this little white girl who we really didn't have a whole lot in common with her, but we admired her. She would seek adventures, and she would kind of set out to find things for her Thing Finders Club. And so we became Thing Finders in the spirit of Pippi Longstocking, traversing our historic neighborhood of Bronzeville. At the time, we didn't know a whole lot about, or didn't really understand. My mother would always tell us how, just the role that Bronzeville played in the city, but we didn't get it as 8, 9, 10-year-olds. But we would set out and, traverse our community, trying to find things for our Thing Finders Club.
What kind of things did you find?
Just nuts and bolts. And we would go into some of the older, the brownstones, or walk up and down the alleys and in the street, in the playground, and just find whatever we could find that seemed something that wasn't incredibly perishable, but just cast-offs that maybe people drop that we just thought were just these really cool items that would fit in this little tin box that we actually found or kind of stole from the janitor's closet. And just little things, maybe they were discarded pens or pencil nubs or something, but they were all, ripe for the taking.
Excellent. So your sister, Kim, she was 3 years younger, right?
Yes.
So how did she get roped in with you guys? Was she just kind of a tag along, or was she, did you welcome her in?
No, my mother, my mother forced her on us, basically. And we would sometimes, it's important to understand the landscape. I often say that this is a story about people, but it's also very much a story about place as well. And so we were coming of age in the Theodore K. Lawless Gardens apartment buildings, 3 24-story buildings in a row. And it was a place that was built by Theodore K. Lawless, was a famous world-renowned Black dermatologist. And he came up with this idea of housing for, in today's parlance, it would be called affordable housing. And it was housing for people who were not kind of middle class and maybe not super poor, but they were working class. And so this community was new, and the elevators were the doors were stainless steel, shiny. The lobbies had floor to ceiling windows, always clean. The janitors chased down garbage with a religious fervor. The playgrounds were, there were 3 playgrounds, each building had one. And the just colorful equipment, the lawns manicured, all of that. And so when we set out, my mother felt incredibly comfortable just letting me, my sister needed to be with me, but we were in this environment that was safe and just, it was lovely.
I want to take a second and throw it out to the group too. If you have any questions for Dawn, go ahead and type them into the chat box. And as we go along, I'll read those questions off to her so that we can really make this a good way for you guys to get engaged and involved in the conversation too, because we would love to hear from you guys. Absolutely. I have questions, but I know you guys have questions too, so let's hear them. So go ahead and type those into the chat box, and as they come in, I'll go ahead and read those. So tell us a little bit about your sister. What was your sister like?
Oh my goodness. My sister was rambunctious, well, first of all, I mean, she and Deborah were incredibly smart girls. I always say that Deborah and I were best friends, but Kim and Deborah were soulmates. They were the type of people who, question authority and question rules. And as I said earlier, just kind of pushed back a little bit. My sister was kind and willful, and just always, she was curious and wanted to know how things worked. She had kind of a mechanical mind, in that she was really interested in the details. Sometimes people see the finished product, but she wanted to know how. She wanted to take things apart and wanted to know how they worked.
Yeah. In which ways did the 3 of you kind of differ? Because reading the book, we can see, the book is really about how you guys diverged, but you're all kind of different personalities, right? So how did you all differ from each other?
As I said earlier, we were coming of age in virtually the same place, but we were from the very beginning, just very different people. I was probably more studious. I was quieter, and my sister, actually, in terms of temperament, she was not this incredibly gregarious person, but she did have her own way of seeing the world, and that um, probably if you told her no, that was the thing, or that was the place that she wanted most to be. You know, don't go there, don't touch that, or don't. That kind of no framing was something that was really interesting to her. Deborah, and when I said earlier that she was the kid who was often in the principal's office, neither one of them, they were not bad kids, but I think that they did not fit that mold, especially, well, actually, I'm not certain that it's unique to that time period, because I think that there are kids who are still, I mean, who may be a little bit more, who may be outliers, who it's still very difficult sometimes, you know, to figure out how do you parent them, how do you teach them. But Deborah and Kim, as I said earlier, they were kindred spirits. And that was my sister with a lot of energy. She was my best friend. I mean, initially we were, you know, sisters in the spirit of, okay, I don't want her around. But as we got older, she really did become, she was my confidant and really my best friend.
As a youngest sibling, I feel that.
Of how many? Youngest of how many siblings?
I have two older sisters.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, I was always the tag along, and mom telling me go, and my sis telling my sisters take her with.
Right. And it's not something that, you know, and I have to say, in the beginning of the book, in the very first chapter, I read about how my sister, when she was younger, there was 35th Street, which was 2 lanes going east and then 2 lanes going west, with a median in the middle. And Deborah and I would have to cross 35th Street in order to get to Lake Meadows, which was the apartment complex where we would hang out. There was this ledge where we would just kind of climb up this little hill, and it was just a ledge that was over a utility building. It was probably about 10 feet high, but you know, for kids, it's a little higher. It's probably something that I would not sit on right now as an adult. But we would have to cross the street. And when my sister was little, she did not want to cross it. And so it was that tension. This was the way to kind of leave her behind. And there were a lot of readers who were like, why did you leave your sister? And as she got older, and we didn't leave her all the time, but there were times when we were just like, okay, well, why don't you just go back home and I'll meet you in the playground or something, because I wanted Deborah all to myself. I wanted her to be my friend. I didn't want to share her the way I had to share everything else in my life with my sister.
Those pesky little sisters, I swear. So for anyone who's not familiar with the book, tell us, the real meat of the book is, like I said before, how your lives kind of diverged. So what ended up happening to Kim and Deborah? There's somebody that in the chat asked, not sure if I missed this in the introduction, but I'd like to know if the other 2 ladies are still alive.
Okay. So yes, so this is the story of the book, and I really don't feel like I'm giving anything away, because I think that the reading, or the story, is what's key here. It's how do we get to these points. So the story is that my sister, my mother and father, and my parents divorced when we were young, but my father played a significant role in our lives. And so the mantra had been for many years to not get pregnant as a teenager. And my sister did get pregnant at 17, and she wound up losing the baby. And she was devastated by that loss. And it was a loss that she really did not recover from. And she began to drink her sorrows. She became an alcoholic, and she died at the age of 24. And so she was the very first, she was the love of my life. And I did not, we did not expect that. We didn't anticipate it. And so we lost her when she was young. And then almost 10 years later, Deborah was dealing with her own challenges and problems. And she wound up being addicted to crack cocaine. And her family had tried desperately to help her with her addiction. and just nothing would hold. And so, or she could not maintain her sobriety. And so one night, she wound up shooting a man. She says, and I believe her, that it was an accident. And she was tried and convicted of murder. And she spent, well, she was sentenced to 50 years. And in Indiana, you get a day off your sentence for every day you serve. And so she knew that she would have to spend 25 years in prison at least. She wound up spending 21 because she got some years deducted for just, great behavior and for going to college while she was, and getting her bachelor's degree while she was in prison.
Oh.
So that was how our lives diverged. And the story is, it really, it's part of the main themes of the story for me is this whole idea of second chances and how we can, before if we're lucky enough, before the clock runs out, we can change our lives. And it's also a story about, I believe it's a story about redemption. My sister, a lot of times what we tend to do is we look at people where they are in that moment that they're standing in front of us, but we don't know the journey that that person has taken. We had never lost, in my family, we had never lost anybody so young to alcoholism. And I think that probably for the longest, and especially if you're 22, 23, 24, in our country, and it's not just our country, but drinking is almost a rite of passage, where there are kids who drink in college, or they may drink before college. And it's hard. And so that she was drinking at 22, and I never saw my sister drunk, never. And that she was drinking, even casually, was something. She was of legal age, and it was something that, just didn't. It never occurred, and I'll say it never occurred to any of us that it would end in her death. Mm-hmm. And so that was part of this story, just trying to understand how what did we miss. And of course, I'm looking at this now through the eyes of, we think of alcoholism and addiction differently now. I think that we've grown up a little bit in terms of our understanding of the impact on our brains and all of that. We still have a long ways to go, but even 20, 30 years ago, it was just very different. Nobody expected her to die. Mm-hmm. And my parents, they did the best that they could. And same with Deborah's parents. Deborah's parents, I think it's just really important to note, there are kids who are born into circumstances where they're almost doomed from the beginning. And my heart, it goes out to those. My heart goes out to those kids. But that was not Deborah's or Kim's story. They both had families who were incredibly important, who had imagined robust futures for them, and that that it just didn't happen that way, especially for my sister. Deborah's another. Deborah's story is a little different because she did 21 years in prison. I, along with her sister and her aunt, picked her up from the Madison Correctional Facility in Indiana in July of 2019 when she was released, and she has flourished since she's been out. But but she had a level of support from family and friends that's kind of unparalleled, or it's just not typically, unfortunately, it's not the norm for a lot of people, men and women who go to prison. And I'll say this one last thing. When as part of the research for the book, or working on the book, I remember corresponding with the judge who sentenced her in 2000, and he remembered her. because he said at the time that she was different because her family surrounded her in the courtroom during the trial. And that was atypical for people who were standing before him for drug-related offenses. And so even 20 years later, her family, now her mother had passed on, and that was one of Deborah's fears, that her mother would pass on while she was in prison. And that did happen while Deborah was in prison. But her Aunt Linda, her sister Darlene, I mean, everybody, and other cousins and other aunts, they've been so supportive of her since while she was in prison and since she's been released.
I want to say I'm so sorry for your loss of your sister, but I'm so glad to hear that Deborah is out and is she doing well?
She's doing incredibly well. Yes.
That's great to hear.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
So about Deborah, what was it like seeing your childhood friend in prison? When was the last time that you had seen her before she went to prison? And what was it like seeing her in there?
Yeah, it had been actually before Deborah went to prison, Kim, my sister and I took a drive to Indianapolis because as we grew up, so we grew up together, but by 8th grade, Deborah's father was concerned that Chicago might not be the best place for her. And his mother had a duplex, a home in Indianapolis, where, with 2 houses connected. And so the family, Deborah and her family left Chicago after 8th grade. So she had graduated from 8th grade, and they left Chicago and moved to Indianapolis. So our friendship by then had started to fray a little bit because we had different groups of friends, but we were still, living one atop the other. But then when Deborah left Indianapolis in 1979, I'm sorry, when she left Chicago for Indianapolis in 1979, we promised to write and to jump on the phone from time to time. And we did that, but that became, that became more and more infrequent. So it wasn't until about 10 years later, maybe 89 or 90, when my sister and I got in the car and we took a road trip, a day trip to Indianapolis. And so that's when I saw Deborah. And when I saw her in person, I had seen her a few times before that over the years, but that's when I saw her, and I could really, that was such a seminal moment, because that pretty little girl that I remembered, she was still, now with makeup, she could still pull it together, but we saw her before she put the makeup on, and you could see the wear and tear and the deterioration that had, that was because of the drug use. And at the time by then I had graduated from college, and I had gotten married, and I had moved out. We'd bought a home in the country, and so we were just living, at that time, we were living very different lives. And so that was the last time I saw her. And then I wouldn't see her again for maybe, for a few years, several years. And the next time I would see her would be, she would be in prison.
And what kind of impact did that have on you, seeing her in prison? Did you visit her while she was in prison?
Yes. Seeing her there, it's really hard to describe. Deborah's personality has always been just incredibly bubbly. She's the type of person who would run up to you and just a big bear hug. And it's so funny because I've always been probably about, 6 inches taller. And so she's always, she's reaching up to hug me. And that is that personality that greeted me in the prison. And she was just, I remember, so a few years, by the time I saw her in prison, it had been years since I had seen her. But in prison, she was clean, she was sober, And I mean, her hair was shiny, her eyes, she's got these beautiful amber colored eyes. And she was herself again. And I just remember hugging her. We were in the visitation room in the prison. And again, bear hug. And just, I mean, we were little girls again. You know, we were these two, we were in our 30s at that point, early 30s. But we were suddenly these little girls who were just, and you know, she would braid my hair, or we would just, you know, we would sidle up next to each other, shoulder to shoulder. Just being in that space meant so much when we were little girls, and that whole feeling was replicated in the prison.
Wow. And so you mentioned that both Deborah and Kim during adolescence kind of showed signs of taking a different path from yourself. Was there anything that you felt you could have done, you or your family, that you could have done to sort of intervene in their behaviors, or?
And I think that's a great question, because that's always I mean, that was a question that I had asked myself for a long time, as you know, and a lot of family members, my parents, aunts and uncles and friends of the family. I mean, they all asked the same question as well. And when you have that question, I think at the root of it is this whole notion of, at least for me, being a part of the three of us, was survivor's guilt. So what happened? Why was I able to figure things out in a different way? And I had to, I think a part of that was me forgiving myself, but also forgiving them, because they made it so difficult for us to save them. Our parents were not rich at all, but they were very resourceful. And so this is a story where I don't at all say that I did everything right and they did everything wrong, because that's not true. I do feel that there, but for the grace of God, go I, because my story could have been their story, and their story could have been my story. And it's always difficult to tell, because, you know, I was not perfect. And I got into, I mean, I was not a lover of the edge. So I never went so close to the edge. But there is no life that any of us can lead in which that you don't arrive at a point where something can happen and change the trajectory of your life. And so that happened to me in college. I was told from a very early age that I should go to college. And I got there, and after my freshman year, I was invited to leave because my grades sucked. And I wound up kind of, you know, clawing my way back. But, and I graduated on time in 4 years and everything. But so, you know, there are times when I've asked myself, well, what would have happened if I didn't go back to college? What would my life look like? So in the story, I didn't want this to be a story, as I said a few minutes ago, that, oh, this is a story about how I always figured everything out. But you know, that's not the case. But what I do think that happened for me was that I surrounded myself with people who were smarter than me, or as smart as me, or I mean, people who could help me when I did slip or have a misstep. And that was the thing that I think that's really important, that I wanted to convey in the book, that they were brilliant, Deborah and Kim. Deborah in prison, when she got her degree, it was in a program that was not at all changed. They did not change the curriculum because the students were inmates, not at all. And so she graduated summa cum laude. And she, you know, with her, she couldn't do it when she was on the outside because of her addiction. But it's so and it's not just that, you know, academics, I mean, that's the sole barometer of intelligence, but she and Kim were incredibly smart. And so what was the difference? And you know, who people did the best that they could. And they tried, our parents, our families, we all tried incredibly hard to just help them help themselves. And so, yeah, this was a story that we've had to live with.
Yeah. Brenda asked a question that's relevant to our topic right now, so I'll go ahead and ask that right now. She says, do you feel the separation from each other negatively impacted Deborah?
The separation from the three of us.
Yeah, well, like when she moved to Indianapolis.
I think that's a great question because, as I said earlier, her father believed that he was moving the family in search of that, that this is kind of the American migration in search of a better life. And he felt like it was going to be completely beneficial. And so what might her life have been like if they hadn't moved? I don't know. I could guess, but I don't want to also put me in the position of being that, I would have been the hero. And if she and I had remained close, then it would have, her circumstances would have been different. Because I think it's important to note that even as we were, so by the time she left Chicago, we were no longer as close as we had been. And, she left, as I said, after the 8th grade. And so our paths started to kind of diverge a bit, maybe around the 5th or 6th grades. I mean, we were still very, very close, but we also had our own friends. And my friends were very much kind of the studious type. I mean, these are kids who were concerned about grades and they're in college. And her friends were a little bit of a faster crowd. I mean, we still loved each other, but so I guess what I'm saying is that it could have been if she had remained in Chicago, her friendships still would have been as they were. And she was very much the type of person who just really, she was a thrill seeker. She wanted the energy from being with the crowd that was just dynamic and just, almost combustible at times.
Yeah. So let's talk about the setting. So Bronzeville, what kind of role does Bronzeville play in your book? And then somebody had also asked, let me get back to that question here. Judy asked, what do you think makes Bronzeville stand out?
Oh, those are excellent questions. Thank you. So Bronzeville is the cradle of the city's Great Migration, and it's where Black people arrived, fleeing the ravages of the Jim Crow South. And my great-grandparents arrived in Bronzeville in 1916 when my grandmother was 3 years old. And so it was 3 years right before the big race riots, the 1919 race riots in Chicago. But initially, they came again, just seeking that American dream in pursuit of a life that was to be robust and meaningful. And they got to the space where in the beginning, that's what it was the promised land. But then as more and more people started to flood the area, then it became, and the city did not pick up the trash or did not replace light bulbs that were blown out. And then landlords were crowding people into various older like brownstones, and so a lot of the buildings fell on disrepair. And so the physical parts of Bronzeville took quite a hit in the beginning. And so I think that the other part of Bronzeville, that the part that our families really focused on in telling the history of the place, was just the culture, the people who had come of age here, or who had spent time, whether it was the trumpeter, and why am I not? Oh my goodness. Okay, so I'll come back to that. But you had Dr. Daniel Hell Williams. You had who was the first surgeon to perform the first heart surgery. You had Gwendolyn Brooks, the amazing poet. Langston Hughes spent some time here. Richard Wright lived in Bronzeville, who wrote Native Son and Black Boy. Ida B. Wells, the famed anti-lynching activist and journalist, lived in Bronzeville. And so growing up, my mother, when she was learning how to drive, she would drive around the neighborhood, and my grandmother just pointing out various places where Tommy Dorsey, who's considered the grandfather of gospel music. So all of this, I mean, you had the arts and culture and science, and you had entrepreneurship. I believe the first Black insurance company in the North was in Bronzeville. You had an amazing just network of banks and entrepreneurs. And so the story, I guess the lesson that our families were trying to tell, and my family as well as Deborah's, I mean, and I'm not certain that we really could get this and understand it as children, but the story of just understanding the place and the history and how there was so much greatness here, and so many people who could be role models, despite patches that were 50 years later, 60 years later, when we were coming of age there, that patches of places where you couldn't, where dreams just couldn't take root and that were unsafe. But it's hard when you have a landscape that is, I mean, there is this tension between, in some places, the way it looks compared to all of just the innovations and the innovators who had lived in this place, who had walked up and down these streets. Joe Louis, the famed boxer, my grandmother would say you could see him walking down the street with like a half pint of butter pecan ice cream, just eating ice cream, walking down the street. But there is, so that's why place was so important in this particular place, to kind of root us in the history of it and to let us know that we could be whoever we wanted to be.
And going back to your childhood in Bronzeville, what was, Brenda asks, what was your greatest joy during that time?
Oh my gosh, there were so many opportunities for us to be kids. I think that a lot of times today there are young people who are growing up in challenging situations, and they have to grow up so fast. But we were allowed to be children and to experience. I mean, our parents had their own issues and challenges, but we could, as I said, we could roam the community looking for things for our Thing Finders Club. We had amazing teachers who took us on at the time, and I'm certain, Chicago public schools, and there are a lot of schools who can't do this now, but we would get on city transit and ride the bus down to the Art Institute or to Orchestra Hall. I remember a Saturday when my second grade teacher, Janet Sherd, whom I thank in the book, she took us to the Museum of Science and Industry, and then she lived in Hyde Park. And then after that, we went to her house for lunch. And this is probably about 20 kids.
Wow.
which is astounding. I was very fortunate in that, or my sister and I were very fortunate in that we were able to travel the country, and we went outside of the country at a young age because we belonged to a church that we had summer tours. But there were kids in the community who weren't as fortunate. And so when our teachers were able to take us on these excursions just downtown and to places outside the neighborhood, that really was meaningful because it broadened what they could see and what they understood of the landscape. And I think their understanding of who they could be because of that movement.
That is so cool. Oh my God. 20 kids in her house. Teachers don't do that anymore.
No. That is extraordinary. It is.
Yes. So as as a child, did books play a significant role in your life? Because
Yes.
I mean, just based on your writing and like obviously, you have a knack for writing. um, did books play a role in your life growing up?
Oh my God, books were a lifeline. I got books in a couple of places. First of all, at home we had a ton of books, and that was very just incredibly grateful. And that was the same in Deborah's house. I mean, she actually had the Encyclopedia Britannica, and that was my first time seeing all of those books. You know, same color, same spine, and all of that in one place outside the library. And so we were almost destined to be friends because of that. But I grew up reading Pippi Longstocking, Trixie Belden, and Nancy Drew, not as much Nancy Drew, but I remember my mother looking at my books, and she she was like, okay, I'm very happy that you're reading, but I want you to read something by an African American author. And she gave me Maud Martha by Gwendolyn Brooks. And Gwendolyn Brooks, to this day, I bow before her writing altar. And at the time I was young and I really didn't understand, just the beautiful metaphors or her language in the book. But I remember getting to about the third chapter and reading about a street called Cottage Grove. And I ran to my mother and said, Mom, we live near a street called Cottage Grove. And my mother thought that I would be most impressed because the people in the book look like me. But what I got just almost viscerally was not only did they look like me, but they lived like me. This was a book that was set in my neighborhood, and I had never read anything like that. And the way Gwendolyn Brooks described the neighborhood made it seem fantastical. I mean, it was my neighborhood, but then it was bigger than my neighborhood. Then the other place where I got my books was the library. And from the library, I know, and a woman called, her name was Mrs. Grady. She would squirrel books away for me. And I would go to school and go there after school to the library, and just I loved it. It was heaven. It was, and then later on, I should say, that when my mother remarried, she married a man who was a security guard, and I write about this at the downtown library, which is now the Cultural Center. But I remember going into that place and that smell, the briny smell of old books, and the echoey, just walking up and down the stacks, and he would bring books. He would bring books home for my sister and me, and that was also heaven. So yeah, we lived in a place where that language was key. I remember my mother, if we would say, well, Mom, where's the coat at? And she would say, in front of the preposition, So words and language and stories and sentences, all of that stuff mattered. We would sit, my sister and I would hide under the table, the dining room table, when my mother, my grandmother, and my aunt were seated around the table, and they would just be talking, and we would be under just eavesdropping. And I loved listening to their stories. And so they never got a chance to write books, but oh my God, they were expert storytellers. And I mean, they were, just so much, so beyond me and my abilities to just weave a yarn to tell a story that's engaging, populated by people, characters who were just so multidimensional and interesting, that all of that really infused and imbued in me this love of reading and telling stories and listening to stories and writing.
So Sarah and I have the same question for you. She asks, what made you want to become a book writer? And I ask, reading and writing are two totally different things. They're tied together, however, they are different. So what was kind of the trigger for you to realize I want to be a writer?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thank you for that. I started out as a pre-med student in college. I love math and science, love math and science to this day. But I was invited to write on one of the newspapers at the university. And that's when I started to love. I mean, I'd always written before college. I love writing, but my parents said, you will not make any money as a writer. So you need to go into one of the professions. And if you want to write, then maybe it's a hobby. And I understood that. I mean, that was kind of the model back then, that whole idea of being either a doctor, a lawyer, engineer, or something like that. But even the idea of being a journalist was not on our radar. And it wasn't until I got to college that I was bitten by the bug of just, interviewing people and wanting, and just how wonderful to be able to have a conversation with somebody and then tell that person's story, and then put it into a larger context. How does that person's story fit into something, what are the universal themes, and how do you connect people through those stories? And then when I learned I could, major in journalism and maybe make a living, then then I was able to convince my parents, first my mom, then my father, that it was something that I could pursue.
And look at you
the
now.
whole art of storytelling. Pardon?
And look at you now.
Well, but the art of storytelling is something that I feel like I was just born, and a lot of us, not just me, but we're often born into these families, and we listen, whether it's the oral tradition of storytelling or people who, write letters or whatever, we have family members who tell these amazing stories.
And how special for you, when you were talking about being under the table, I can picture you and your sister. I used to do the same thing. And how special to hear those stories firsthand. And did the older folks, did they ever dumb things down because they knew you were under there, or did you hear it raw and unfiltered?
Well, my mother would look around and realize if we were under there, because initially they would speak freely. And we just didn't understand. By the time we grew, we were big enough, too big to be under the table, we might understand what they were saying. That was a different, paradigm. But when we were very young and we're under there, they would speak freely, and then my mother would slam her hand down on the table, and she'd be like, "You guys are the nosiest children God ever gave breath to. Get out from under grown folks' business." And that's when she would push us out. But yeah, I mean, just really going back, and there were times when my sister and I would be like, they were talking about this, they were talking about, oh my God, they were talking, so we were deciphering it as adults, going like, what?
That's so funny. Here, what is this? Brenda doesn't have a question, but she says, I live near Cottage Grove now in the Bronzeville/Hyde Park area.
Oh, very good.
Yeah.
Fantastic. It's an area that has really changed over the years, and there are a lot of dynamic things happening there now.
So have you been back to visit recently?
Oh yeah, I went back quite a bit to just writing the book, and I have friends there now. And the landscape is very different. The public housing project that had been right across the street from where I grew up has all been demolished as part of the city's plan for transformation. And I believe the last building was probably torn down in the early 2000s. No, in around 2011 or something like that. And so that has changed. And so yeah, I mean, there's a lot, there's this the balance between the gentrification that is definitely happening, but this desire, and it's an imperative to make sure that there is affordable housing in the area. It has always been this beautifully situated area, right? I mean, a stone's throw from the lakefront. I could look out of my living room window and look out onto the lake, and then so close to downtown. But the goal is, and I hope that it's achieved, that they can maintain this balance of affordable housing as well as housing for more affluent residents.
Yeah, I always getting onto Lakeshore Drive, I always see the big Bronzeville sign. I love it. So you mentioned the gentrification and the changes that have been happening throughout the years. So with all of those changes, whenever you go back to Bronzeville, do you still feel a sense of home?
Absolutely. It is like coming home. And because my mother grew up in that area, and so I'm the third or the fourth generation of my family to live in the area. It's interesting that she, even though the housing project has been torn down, she also has this feeling of coming home. And so it's interesting to see that in her as well. But that is one of those universal feelings of when you return to your childhood home. It's this time capsule. It's where your memories are and your dreams, and that little person still exists somewhere in the universe. Who used to be, who roamed those streets.
Yes, I feel that to my core. I grew up in Evergreen Park. It's my hometown. I moved away and um, recently, within the past few years, came back, and I feel that same sense of home. And there's a little Jenna out there somewhere,
Yes,
still walking up and down California Avenue.
absolutely.
Judy asked, "What library did you go to, and is it still there?"
Yes, I went to the library, and I think it's called the King Branch now, or maybe it's the Douglas Branch, but it's at 35th Street and King Drive, and on the west side of the street. It's probably like 34 between 34th and 35th Street, but it's closer to 35th Street. But I loved it. I have not been in a while, in many years, so I have not been back to the library in a long time. But it was like my second home.
I love hearing that. My librarian heart goes, yay.
Well, it's sincere. Yeah, what you guys do, I mean, it's really, it's just invaluable. It's so important because not everybody can afford to buy, every book that he or she reads. So to be able to have the library is this wonderful repository where you can just come in. And I remember getting my first library card. And I also remember it wearing down and being threadbare and then having to get another one. But yeah, absolutely.
And do you still live in the Chicagoland area?
I am in the Chicagoland. Yes, yes. Yeah, and
And
I have a library card.
excellent. That was gonna be my follow-up.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So this book made multiple best of lists, which has to be so exciting for you.
Yes,
Congratulations.
thank you.
How does that make you feel? What kind of feeling does it give you?
Yeah, it's humbling. I pinch myself because we write in isolation. We're in this cocoon. We writers, and so once your finished product goes out into the world, you never know how it's going to be received. And the reception for Three Girls from Bronzeville has just been it's been so moving to see it on best of lists like the New York Times, the Washington Post, BuzzFeed, and there are several libraries around. I think it was on the Chicago Public Library's best of list, and actually it was. And but I'm not certain if I'm cheating a little bit with it being the hometown. Chicago Tribune's list, and so it was just really it's gratifying, and as I said, humbling. And I'm just incredibly grateful.
Yeah, congratulations again. That's very
Thank
exciting.
you.
Brenda doesn't have a question, but she said, I haven't read the book and plan to get it soon. A very compelling story that I look forward to.
Thank you. The thing that I want people to know is that it is, I mean, there are a lot of moments in this book where people have told me that those moments made them laugh. And I know that there are moments that made me laugh while writing it. I mean, there are some very, there's some tough moments, but just like with our lives, surrounding those tough moments are moments of joy and playfulness and all of that. And so it's not a downer of a story at all. It's a story that really is about redemption and second chances, and really those bonds that we make in childhood, those that being girlfriends, those friendships, the sisterhood, all of that stuff. I mean, they are so affecting that they stay with you forever. I mean, everybody on this Zoom platform tonight, I mean, we remember our first best friend. I mean, it's just, that is a meaning, that period in our lives. It's just it's so affecting that it's hard to shake.
Yeah. What was your process like while you were writing this book? How did you do your research? When did you start writing it?
I started to think about well, first of all, I first wrote about Deborah in the pages of the Chicago Tribune in the year 2000. And that's when she was about to go on trial. And I never really, I guess as a writer, we work our stuff out, writing and telling stories and trying to process things that way. And so I wrote a perspectives piece about her. But initially I thought that was going to be it. It was like I would exercise those demons and that would be it. But then the amount of email that I got, I don't think it was email at that time though, I think it was actual snail mail letters, was just, it was overwhelming, and I hadn't anticipated that much interest in her story. And then I wrote about her again in 2002. And then when I wrote about her in 2007, she was graduating from college. And that's when I got email from all over the world. And letters, people just wanting to talk about her story and how much compassion they had for her. And one man said, I'll never forget, he said, I never thought I could have compassion for someone who committed murder. And I understand that, because we feel, that's typically, I mean, clearly it's a heinous crime. But when we say it that way, just those words, someone committed murder, then when we start if we go back and if we're allowed the opportunity to understand how that person, how that moment came to be, then we understand that it's so much more complex than that. So anyway, I started to think about her story. I had never written about my sister. In 2010, Westmore, the author Westmore, published The Other Westmore. And I read that book. Yes, it's fantastic. And then I thought, well, maybe there's a story about these two girls, because at the time, I married a man completely unrelated to Deborah with the last name Trice. And so I was Dawn Turner Trice. And so you had the story about these two men named Westmore. I thought, well, maybe there could be a story about two women with the last name Trice. But the difference was that I had known her growing up, and Westmore did not know the other Westmore until they met years later. And so that's when I started to think about it as being a book. I started to put together a proposal. And when I gave the first iteration of that to my agent at the time, she said, this isn't a story about two girls. This is a story about three girls, because my sister, true to form, leapt off the page. And so that was kind of when I started to think of it as it being a book, as our story being a book. And just the process, I had these threads, I had all of this information. I had letters that Kim sent me when I was in college. I had letters that Deborah sent me. I had just diary entries and journal entries. And then I had hundreds and hundreds of court documents related to hundreds and hundreds of pages of court documents related to Deborah's case. And so there was a lot of information to sift through and put aside. And so the journalist in me felt like, oh, I can do this. I'm a journalist. But I was completely, I think you have to be a little delusional to believe that you can write a memoir anyway. but me thinking that I could just go back and tackle this as a journalist, not as somebody who's, a thinking and feeling human being who, one of the ways that we get through our challenges and through our grief is to pack that stuff away. But here I am reopening the closet and the boxes and going back in there, and so completely not prepared for just how there were times when I would write a sentence and literally had to walk a mile, get outside and walk a mile just to work through those feelings again. So it was one of those. So I mean, that's kind of the genesis of the writing. I mean, why I saw this as a book. But then the how of it was just a matter of, talk about clawing your way through, sifting through a lot of material and just figuring out, because as you said at the opening, this is not just my story. It's a story of three girls, and just making sure that I was able to give equal weight to those stories and to show how they connected. I look at this book sometimes and still feel like it's a miracle. There are days when I would call some of my best friends and I'd be like, who said I could do this? Who said that I could write a memoir like this? And yeah.
Well, you mentioned friends, that, and then going back to, talking about friendships as a child and, your first friend. Who was this? Brenda? Yes, Brenda asked, do you currently have friendships that impact you deeply? And how different are they from your youth?
Oh my goodness. They're different and the same. Yes, I do have friendships with people who are just, we're so close that I would do anything for them and they would do anything for me. And the difference is that, as you get older, you just know more and you understand, at least for me, you're more forgiving, you're less likely to cut off people, cut off or in relationships because of minor infractions or something, or maybe you are more likely, or you're better able as an older person to be able, or more mature person, and mature in terms of personality and temperament, you're also able to better identify those attributes in people that just may not serve you well. And so you do both. You make sure that you nourish the relationships that need to be, and then you get rid of the ones that don't need to stay. And so I think that is the key. Deborah and I are still very close. And as I said, she's thriving. And so that's what and then I have my other friendships, people who I can call and say, who said I could write this book? and they're able to talk me down, and I talk them down, and we enjoy each other.
I was going to ask, what do your friends say? Because that says a lot.
Yeah. Right.
There aren't any other questions in the chat. So I want to ask, lastly, what are you working on now?
Yeah, I am working on a novel. I had written 2 novels prior to the nonfiction book, the memoir, and I feel pulled toward fiction again.
Mm-hmm.
And so I am in the middle of putting together a proposal for that, and that requires me to write 100 pages. And so that's where I am. I've got 100 pages that I'm massaging and editing and getting ready to show to an editor friend so that we can, so that I can determine if there is a book there or not. But I really do. We both actually feel like there is.
Yeah. Wow. You didn't take much of a break from finishing this one to moving on to the next one.
I did kind of, actually. I didn't write a whole lot last year as we were running up to the release date and launch of this book. And so I couldn't write in that space because you really do need a break after you've tackled a big writing project,
Mm.
like, like, I mean, any big writing project, especially a book. I should say that I needed a break. But one of the things that I do really well when it comes to writing is that if I have an idea, if I have a line or a sentence, or if something jumps out at me, I'm really good at writing something on a scrap piece of paper, and just, putting it into a pile that I have in a bin of just little scraps of paper, with little things jotted down, just so that I don't lose that, whatever that feeling was, whatever that moment was that I wanted to capture.
That's a better method than mine of just writing it down on a piece of scrap paper and leaving it willy-nilly on my desk, because that's what happens, and then I forget about
As
it.
long as you can find it. I mean, that's the thing that's key.
Before I close out, I wanted to share my screen really quick. Um, and for those of you who are interested in purchasing a copy of the book, um, Bookies here on Western Avenue. There we go. On Western Avenue has copies of Three Girls from Bronzeville. And so go support your local bookshop. Of course, we have copies in the library, so you could check those out too. But if you would like to own your own copy of the book, Bookies, our local shop, has copies of it. So you can visit the link to shop Bookies on your screen, or if you have your phone handy, just open up your camera app and snap a photo of that QR code, and that'll take you straight to their website so you can purchase copies of Dawn's book. Dawn, I want to thank you so much for doing this for us. This was amazing, and you're such a pleasure to talk to.
It was a pleasure speaking with you, and I'm so honored that we had this audience and that you guys invited me. I mean, really, it's just it's a privilege to be able to, to hang out with you guys. So thank you so much. And I love your questions.
Oh, thank you. And thank you guys so much for throwing your questions into the chat. I love it when we can make it more personal and get you guys involved in the discussion too. Brenda just said that they're considering this book for their book club read. So there you go.
Well, I would love to join you guys, Brenda. So thank you so much. If you do choose it.
And if you want us to connect both of you, then feel free to reach out to me, and we can put you guys into contact.
That would be great.
Yeah. Well, with that, again, I want to thank you, Dawn, for joining us, and good luck on your next endeavor.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, really. Thank you so much.
We'll look forward to your next one.
Thank you, guys.
All right. Have a fantastic night, and thank you, everybody, for joining us. See you at the library.